I want to tell you something tonight that I've never really told a full room before. And I'm standing here and my hands are a little cold and I can feel that familiar tightness right here in my throat that comes when you're about to say something true. Something that costs you something to say out loud. The title of tonight's story is I lent my brother my credit card and he bought a house with it. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that sounds insane. You're thinking that sounds like a punchline or clickbait or some kind of exaggeration. But I need you to understand something right now. Right at the top of this, it's not a metaphor. It's not hyperbole. It happened. And the worst part, the part that keeps me up some nights even now, is that I let it happen. I enabled it. I made it possible because I didn't know how to say no to the people I loved. Because I thought love meant erasing yourself, making yourself smaller, giving until there was nothing left. But before we get to the house, before we get to the credit card and the betrayal and the moment I realized I'd been, what's the word? Used, we need to go back. We need to go back to who I was before all of this. Because that's the only way you'll understand how someone like me, someone who thought they were smart, someone who'd read all the right books and knew all the right things to say, how someone like me ended up here. I grew up in a house where silence was a language. You know what I mean? Where the things we didn't say mattered more than the things we did. My father was a good man, I think, but he was a kind of good man who worked 70 hours a week and came home and sat in his chair and didn't speak, didn't ask questions. And my mother, she filled the silence with rules, with expectations, with this constant hum of be better, do more, don't embarrass us. And my brother, let's call him Danny because that's his name and he knows the story, and honestly, he probably wouldn't care if I told it because that's who Danny is. Danny was different. Danny was the one who could do no wrong. You know this person, right? Every family has one. The golden child. The one who gets caught stealing from mom's purse, but it's just a misunderstanding. The one who wrecks the car, but it's the other driver's fault. The one who shows up 3 hours late to Thanksgiving and everyone just laughs it off. Oh, that's Danny. I was the other one, the responsible one. The one who got good grades and cleaned up after myself and made sure everyone else was okay before I even thought about what I needed. I was the one my parents didn't worry about because I didn't give them reasons to worry. And you know what that gets you? You know what being the good one gets you? Nothing. It gets you nothing except the expectation that you'll keep being good. Keep being easy. Keep not needing anything. I remember this one time, I must have been 14, maybe 15. I came home with this achievement, I'd won this writing competition, statewide. There was a ceremony and everything. And I'd gotten this plaque with my name engraved on it. And I was so proud. I walked in the door holding this thing like it was the Olympic torch. And my mom was on the phone. And she glanced at me and held up one finger. Wait, that finger said. So I waited. Danny came home 20 minutes later. No ceremony, no plaque. Just Danny. And he got a C+ on a math test he'd been failing. And my mother hung up the phone mid-sentence to hug him, to tell him how proud she was, how hard he must have worked. I put my plaque in my room. Nobody ever asked about it. I'm not trying to make you feel sorry for me. I'm not trying to paint myself as some tragic figure. I'm trying to show you how these things work, how these patterns get built, brick by brick, moment by moment. How you learn to make yourself invisible because being visible doesn't get you anything except more responsibility, more expectation, more of this quiet, gnawing feeling that you're only valuable when you're useful to someone else. So I became useful. I became the person people called when they needed something. The person who always said yes, always had time, always had money or energy or advice or shoulder or whatever it was. And Danny learned that he could ask me for anything, and I'd give it. Because that's what I did. That's who I was. The first time he asked to borrow money, we were in our 20s. He was 23, maybe. I was 26. He called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and I was in bed reading. I remember the book. It was this novel by a friend of mine, Michael, who'd just gotten published, and I was trying to focus on it, but I kept thinking about my own manuscript sitting in my desk drawer. The one I hadn't touched in months because I'd been working 60-hour weeks at a job I hated to save up for. I don't even remember what anymore. Anyway, Danny called. He said he needed $800 rent. He'd gotten behind, and his landlord was threatening to evict him, and he just needed a little help. Just this once, just to get back on his feet. And I could hear it in his voice that edge of desperation, that crack that made him sound like he was 16 again. And I couldn't say no. I sent him the money. He never paid me back, not a dollar of it. But he called again 6 months later, and then again, and then again. And each time, the amount got bigger. And each time, the excuse got more elaborate. And each time, I told myself, this is the last time. After this, I'm done. After this, I'm going to set boundaries. I never did. You know why? Because saying no felt like failing. It felt like admitting that I wasn't good enough, strong enough, generous enough. It felt like proving my parents right, that I was the one who didn't give enough, who held back, who was selfish. That was the word I was terrified of. Selfish. So I kept giving, and Danny kept taking. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person to him and became a resource, an ATM, a safety net he never had to think about, because it was always just there. I had this apartment back then, small, studio, in a neighborhood that, look, it wasn't great, but it was mine. I remember the radiator clanged all winter, and the upstairs neighbor played the same song over and over every night, Drops of Jupiter by Train, if you can believe it. And sometimes I'd lie in bed at 2 in the morning listening to that song through the ceiling and feeling like I was living someone else's life. Like I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in this dim, cramped space that smelled like old carpet and radiator dust, working a job that made me feel hollow. Giving away money I didn't have to a brother who didn't even say thank you anymore. But I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was building toward something. I was writing. I was working on a book. I was going to make it. Whatever that meant, I was going to become someone. And then my friend Sarah, who I'd known since college, Sarah, who was one of those people who just seemed to have it figured out, She had the job and the apartment and the boyfriend and the confidence, all of it. Sarah called me one afternoon and asked if I wanted to get coffee. And when we met up, she looked at me across the table with this expression I'd never seen before. This kind of sad, concerned look. And she said, "Are you okay?" Just like that. "Are you okay?" And I opened my mouth to say, yes, of course, I'm fine, everything's fine, because that's what I always said. But something in the way she asked it, something in the way she was looking at me, like she could see through all the layers of fine I'd wrapped around myself, something broke. I started crying right there in the coffee shop, just tears running down my face while I held this paper cup of burnt coffee. And I couldn't even explain why I was crying because I didn't know. I just knew that, no, I wasn't okay. I hadn't been okay for a long time. Sarah reached across the table and held my hand, and she didn't try to fix it or offer advice or tell me it would get better. She just sat there with me while I cried in public like a child. And that small act of witnessing, I guess, that was the first time in years someone had looked at me and seen me. Not what I could do for them, not how I could help, just me. I wish I could tell you that was the moment everything changed, that I went home and stood up to Danny and set boundaries and became this empowered version of myself. But that's not what happened, because change doesn't work like that. It's not a light switch. It's more like trying to turn a cargo ship around in the middle of the ocean. You can turn the wheel, but the ship keeps going in the same direction for a long, long time before you see any difference. What happened instead was smaller, quieter. I went home that night, and I sat on my couch in that cramped studio with the clanging radiator, and I thought about what Sarah had asked me. "Are you okay?" And I thought about how I'd been living, how I'd been disappearing, how I'd made myself so small and so useful that I'd forgotten I was allowed to take up space, to need things, to say no. I pulled out my manuscript that night, the one I'd abandoned, and I started reading it, and it was terrible. It was so bad, but it was mine. It was something I'd made, something that existed because I'd existed, and that felt important somehow. I started writing again, not every day, not in this grand, disciplined way, but in stolen moments, on lunch breaks, late at night, when I couldn't sleep. I started putting words on the page again, and it felt like I was building a ladder out of a hole I'd been stuck in, rung by rung, word by word. And then Danny called again. This time, he needed more than $800. This time, he needed $3,000, some business ideas, some investment opportunities. I don't even remember the details because they didn't matter. The details never mattered. What mattered was that he was asking, and I had trained myself to say yes. But this time, I hesitated. I felt this flicker of Something in my chest? Resistance, maybe? The beginning of a no trying to form itself. I told him I needed to think about it. And he laughed. He actually laughed. Like the idea that I would think about it, that I wouldn't just immediately say yes, was absurd. Come on, he said. It's me. I'm your brother. You're not really going to make me wait, are you? And I could hear it in his voice. That expectation, that assumption, that certainty that I would do what I always did. Give in, hand over whatever he wanted. Because that's what I was for. I told him I'd call him back. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Drops of Jupiter for what felt like the 1,000th time. And I thought about all the times I'd said yes when I meant no. All the times I'd folded myself up to make room for someone else. All the ways I'd been taught that my value was in how much I could give away. And I thought about Sarah asking me if I was okay. And I thought about my manuscript sitting on my desk, half finished and imperfect, but alive. And somewhere around 3 a.m, I decided I was going to say no. I called Danny the next day, and my hands were shaking when I dialed. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, thin, uncertain. I told him I couldn't lend him the money, that I was sorry, but I just couldn't do it this time. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then he said, "Are you serious right now?" And I said yes. I was serious. And he got angry. He said I was being selfish. He said family was supposed to help family. He said he couldn't believe I was doing this to him, that he'd always been there for me, which wasn't true, but I didn't correct him, and that he was disappointed in me. Disappointed in me. I hung up feeling like I'd done something wrong, like I'd failed some fundamental test of goodness. But I also felt something else, something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like I'd chosen myself. Just once. Just this one time. I'd chosen myself. And I thought that was it. I thought that was the end of it. Danny would be mad for a while. And then he'd get over it. And eventually things would go back to normal. That I'd learned my lesson, set my boundary. And now I could move forward. I had no idea what was coming. Because 2 months later, 2 months of relative peace, 2 months of focusing on my writing and my work and trying to figure out who I was when I wasn't being useful to someone else. 2 months later, I got a call from a credit card company asking about a charge I didn't recognize. A very large charge. The kind of charge that makes your stomach drop and your vision go gray at the edges. And that's when I learned what Danny had done. That's when I learned about the house. The woman on the phone was very polite, very professional. She had that practice tone customer service people use when they're delivering bad news, but trying to keep you calm, like a flight attendant explaining turbulence. She said there had been unusual activity on my account. She said there was a charge for $47,000. She asked if I'd authorized it. I was at work. I remember that detail so clearly. I was sitting at my desk in this gray cubicle under fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, and I had a half-eaten sandwich in front of me that suddenly looked obscene. Like food was this absurd concept. Like eating was something people did in a world that made sense, and I just exited that world. I told her no. I hadn't authorized it. There must be some mistake. She put me on hold. The hold music was classical, Vivaldi, I think. The Four Seasons. Spring. All bright and cheerful and completely at odds with the ice spreading through my chest. When she came back, she told me the charge was for a down payment on a property. A house. In Nevada. And the billing address on file was my brother's. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't remember the rest of that conversation. I know I said words. I know she said words. Something about fraud protection and filing a report and freezing the account. But all I could hear was this ringing in my ears, this high-pitched whine like feedback from a microphone. And all I could think was, he wouldn't do this. Danny wouldn't do this. Not to me. But he had. I called him immediately. My hand was shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. It rang 4 times before he picked up, and when he answered, his voice was casual, light. Hey, what's up? What's up? Like we were just catching up, like nothing was wrong. I asked him about the charge, about the house, and there was this pause, this long, heavy pause that felt like the space between lightning and thunder. That moment when you know something terrible is coming, but it hasn't hit yet. And then he said, "Oh, yeah, I was going to tell you about that." He was going to tell me. I waited for him to explain, to apologize, to say something that would make this make sense. But what he said instead was worse than anything I'd imagined. He said he'd needed a cosigner, that he'd found this amazing investment property, this foreclosure in Vegas that he could flip for twice what he paid for it. But he couldn't qualify for the mortgage on his own. So he'd use my credit card for the down payment. And he said this like it was reasonable. He'd been planning to pay me back once the deal went through, once he sold the house. He was doing this for both of us, he said. We'd split the profits. I'd thank him later. I asked him how he got my credit card information. Another pause. Then, you left it at Mom and Dad's last Christmas. I took a picture of it, just in case. Just in case. Just in case he needed to commit fraud, apparently. Just in case he needed to destroy my credit and my trust, and whatever shreds of a relationship we had left. I told him he had to fix this. Immediately. Cancel the sale, return the money. I didn't care how. He had to fix it. And he got defensive. He said I was overreacting. He said it wasn't a big deal, that the money would be back in my account in a few months, that I was being dramatic. And then, and this is the part that still makes my throat tight when I think about it, he said, I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd want to help me. Help him. Like this was helping. Like stealing from me was some kind of favor I should be grateful for. I hung up. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just hung up and sat there in my cubicle under those humming fluorescent lights, and I felt nothing, just nothing, like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that made me feel like a person and left behind this hollow space where air moved through, but nothing else. My coworker, Jennifer, a woman I barely knew, who sat 3 cubicles down and always smelled like peppermint tea. She walked by and saw me sitting there, and she stopped. She asked if I was okay. That phrase again. Are you okay? I looked at her and I tried to smile, tried to say yes, but what came out instead was, my brother stole from me, just like that, to a near stranger in a fluorescent hallway, because I needed to say it out loud to someone. I needed to make it real. Jennifer sat down, right there on the floor of the hallway, in her pencil skirt and heels. She sat down next to my cubicle, and she listened while I told her everything. About Danny, about the credit card, about the years of lending money and getting nothing back, and feeling invisible, and now this. When I finished, she said something I've never forgotten. She said, you know it's not about the money, right? And I said, what do you mean? It's $47,000. It's absolutely about the money. And she shook her head. It's about him knowing he could. It's about him knowing you wouldn't stop him. That's the real theft. She was right. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls and police reports and lawyers. I filed fraud charges. I froze my credit. I changed every password on every account I had. I found out that because Danny was family, the legal process was more complicated, that prosecutors didn't like pursuing cases between relatives, that I'd probably never see that money again, and even if I did, it would take years. My credit score tanked, a score I'd spent my entire adult life building, paying every bill on time, keeping balances low, doing everything right gone, destroyed in a single transaction by someone who shared my blood. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake at night replaying every conversation, every time I'd lent him money, every time I'd said yes when I should have said no. I'd think about all the signs I'd ignored, the way he never asked how I was doing, the way he only called when he needed something, the way he trained me over years and years to believe that my purpose was to give him what he wanted. I felt stupid, so deeply, profoundly stupid. How had I not seen this coming? How had I let it get this far? My parents found out. I don't even know how. Maybe Danny told them, maybe someone else did. But my mother called me, and I really thought she was calling to check on me, to make sure I was okay, to offer support. Instead, she asked if I was really going to press charges against my own brother. I said yes. She said I was tearing the family apart, that Danny made a mistake, but everyone makes mistakes. And couldn't I just forgive him? Couldn't we work this out between us? I asked her if she understood what he'd done, if she grasped the magnitude of it. $47,000. Fraud. Years of my financial life destroyed. And she said, and I'll never forget this, never. She said, but you've always been the strong one. He'll bounce back. Danny needs more help than you do. I hung up on her too. I stopped going to family dinners. Stopped returning calls. I cut myself off from everyone who thought that my strength meant I didn't deserve protection. that my capability meant I didn't deserve consideration, that being the responsible one meant I should just absorb this and move on. I was alone, more alone than I'd ever been. But I was also free, in this strange, terrifying way. Free from the weight of being what everyone needed me to be. I threw myself into my writing. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that felt like mine. I worked on my manuscript every day, sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for hours. I wrote about betrayal and family and the ways we hurt each other and the ways we survive. I wrote myself through the anger and the grief and the crushing, exhausting weight of having been used. My friend Sarah came over one night with wine and Thai food, and we sat on my couch. I'd moved by then to a smaller apartment, trying to save money to pay off the debt. And she said, "You look different." I asked her what she meant. "Harder," she said, "but also more here, more solid. Does that make sense?" It did. It felt harder. I felt like something in me had calcified, turned to stone. But I also felt present in my own life in a way I hadn't before, like I'd been sleepwalking for years and finally woken up. I asked her if that was a good thing. She thought about it. Then she said, "I think it's a necessary thing." The legal process dragged on. Months turned into a year. Danny never apologized. Not once. He sent me angry texts telling me I was ruining his life, that I was vindictive, that I'd always been jealous of him, that I'd never understood him. I stopped reading them eventually, blocked his number. But before I did, I sent him one final message. I told him that I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to stop carrying the weight of his choices. But I also told him that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, that he'd show me who he was, and I believed him now, and that I was done. He never responded. My parents chose him. That was the hardest part, if I'm being honest. Harder than the money. Harder than the betrayal. They chose him. They kept inviting him to holidays and taking his calls and treating me like I was the one who'd done something wrong, like I was the one who'd broken the family by refusing to stay broken myself. I spent that Thanksgiving alone, my first holiday without family. I made a small meal, just a chicken breast and some vegetables, and I ate it at my kitchen table by myself. And I cried. I cried because I was alone and because everything had fallen apart and because the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had put conditions on that love, and I'd failed to meet them. But I also felt something else, something small and fragile, but real. Relief. I felt relieved that I didn't have to pretend anymore, that I didn't have to make myself small, that I didn't have to swallow my anger or my hurt or my truth to make everyone else comfortable. That winter was dark. I don't mean that metaphorically, though it was that too. I mean the days were short and gray, and I lived in this apartment that didn't get much natural light. I'd come home from work in the dark and sit in the dark and write in the dark. I lost weight, not intentionally. I just forgot to eat sometimes. Food felt like an afterthought. Sarah worried about me. Jennifer from work checked in. I had a few people who saw me, really saw me, and didn't let me disappear completely. I'm grateful for that. I don't know where I'd be without them. But mostly I was on my own, learning how to be a person who said no, who had boundaries, who didn't equate love with self-erasure. It was the loneliest year of my life, but it was also the year I started to become someone I could respect. I finished my manuscript in February. It is a book about a family, about the lies we tell ourselves to survive, about the cost of being the good one, about learning to choose yourself even when it means losing everyone else. I sent it to an agent I'd met at a conference years earlier. I didn't expect anything. By that point, I'd learned not to expect things. Expectation felt dangerous. Like hope was just another way to set yourself up for disappointment. But she wrote back. She said she'd stayed up all night reading it, that it was raw and honest and painful and necessary, that she wanted to represent me. I read her email 3 times before I believed it was real. Then I cried. Again. But this time it was different. This time it felt like release. The book sold. Not for millions of dollars or anything dramatic. But it sold. It was going to be published. Something I'd made, something I'd bled onto the page during the darkest year of my life, was going to exist in the world. I called Sarah. I called Jennifer. I wanted to call my parents, wanted to hear my mother say she was proud of me, wanted my father to acknowledge that I'd done something real. But I didn't, because I knew they wouldn't understand. They'd find some way to minimize it or redirect the conversation to Danny or make it about something other than me. So I celebrated with the people who'd shown up, the people who'd sat with me in the dark and didn't try to force me into the light before I was ready. And I kept writing, because that's what you do when you've lost everything else. You hold on to the thing that's yours. The book came out on a Tuesday in October. I remember because it was raining, one of those cold, insistent rains that feels personal somehow, like the sky is trying to tell you something. I'd arranged to do a reading at a small independent bookstore in Brooklyn, the kind of place with creaky floors and mismatched chairs and the smell of old paper and coffee. Maybe 50 people showed up, maybe less. I stood there with my hands shaking, holding this book that had my name on it, my words inside it, and I read the first chapter out loud. It's about a sister, about how she gives and gives until she's hollow, about how her family takes and takes until there's nothing left. And when I finished, the room was quiet, not uncomfortable quiet, thoughtful quiet, the kind of quiet that means people are actually listening. A woman in the third row raised her hand during the Q&A. She was maybe in her 60s, gray hair kind of eyes. She said, "Did you ever talk to your brother again? After everything?" I'd been dreading this question, hoping no one would ask it, but also knowing someone would, because that's what people want to know. They want a neat ending, the reconciliation, the moment where everyone hugs and learns their lesson and the family is whole again. I told her the truth. I said no. I hadn't spoken to Danny in over 3 years, that I didn't know if I ever would again, that some things break in ways that don't heal, and that's okay, that you're allowed to walk away from people who hurt you, even if they're family, especially if they're family. She nodded like she understood, like maybe she had her own Danny, her own person who taught her that blood doesn't mean permission. After the reading, people lined up to get their book signed, and this young woman, maybe 22, 23, she came up to the table and she was crying, not dramatically, just quiet tears running down her face. And she said, "Thank you. Thank you for writing this. I have a sister who I thought I was the only one who felt this way. I signed her book, and I wanted to tell her she'd be okay, that it gets better, that time heals all wounds or whatever bullshit platitude people say. But I didn't, because that felt like lying. Instead, I told her it gets different, that the wound might always be there, but you learn to live around it. You learn to build a life that doesn't require their approval or their presence. You learn that you're enough, just as you are, even when the people who are supposed to love you can't see it." She hugged me, this stranger, this young woman I'd never met. She hugged me tight, and I could feel her shoulders shaking. And I thought, this is why you write. This is why you tell the truth, even when it costs you. The book did okay. Not a bestseller, okay. Not quit your day job, okay. But people read it. People connected with it. I got emails from readers all over the country telling me their own stories, their own Dannys, their own families who'd taken advantage of their goodness until goodness felt like weakness. And slowly, so slowly, I almost didn't notice, things started to shift. I got better freelance work, writing opportunities, invitations to speak at events. My financial situation improved, not overnight, not magically, but incrementally. I paid off chunks of the debt. My credit score crept back up. I moved to a better apartment, one with windows that actually let in light. I started dating again, tentatively at first. I'd forgotten how to trust people, forgotten how to let someone in without immediately worrying about what they take from me. There were some false starts. Some guys who reminded me too much of Danny, charming and careless and happy to let me do all the emotional labor. I walked away from those ones quickly. I learned to recognize the red flags I'd missed for so many years. And then I met James, at a reading actually, another one of those bookstore events. He was in the audience, and during the Q&A he asked me about craft, about how I structured the narrative. And it was clear he'd actually read the book, really read it, not just skimmed it or read the back cover. We went for coffee after, then dinner, then more dinners. He was a high school English teacher, the kind who actually cared about his students, who stayed late to help kids with their essays, who believed in the power of stories to change lives. He'd lost his father to cancer 2 years earlier, and he understood grief, understood the weight of it. He didn't try to fix me or save me or tell me to get over my family stuff. He just listened, made space for all of it. I'm not going to tell you it was perfect. It wasn't. I was still prickly, still guarded, still flinching every time he did something nice because I was waiting for the catch, for the moment he'd reveal what he really wanted from me. But he was patient. He let me set the pace. And slowly, I started to believe that maybe not everyone was Danny. Maybe some people give without keeping score. We've been together for 4 years now. We don't live together. I'm not ready for that, and he understands. Maybe someday, maybe never. But he's there. He's consistent. When he says he'll call, he calls. When he makes a promise, he keeps it. These small, unremarkable things that feel revolutionary when you spent your life with people who treated commitments like suggestions. My second book came out last year. It did better than first. Made some lists. Got some attention. I was invited to do interviews, podcasts, and a small book tour. People started recognizing my name. And you know what? My parents called, not to apologize, not to acknowledge what had happened or how they'd handled it, but to tell me they'd seen me on some morning show, that they were proud of me, that they'd always known I'd be successful. I didn't know what to say. I felt this surge of anger. Because where were they 3 years ago? Where were they when I was eating dinner alone on Thanksgiving? Where were they when I was drowning in debt and devastation? But I also felt tired. Tired of being angry. Tired of carrying this around. I didn't reconcile with them. I want to be clear about that. There was no tearful reunion, no healing conversation where we all laid our cards on the table and worked through our issues. But I did start taking their calls occasionally. We have surface-level conversations. They tell me about their garden, their friends. I tell them about my work. We don't talk about Danny. We don't talk about what happened. Maybe that makes me a coward. Maybe that means I'm still avoiding the hard stuff. Or maybe it just means I've chosen to let them exist in my life in the limited way they're capable of existing. Not because they've earned it, but because I've decided the cost of complete estrangement is higher than the cost of controlled contact. Maybe that's growth. Maybe it's just survival. I honestly don't know. I think about Danny sometimes. Wonder if he ever sold that house. Wonder if he ever thought about me. If he ever felt guilty. I doubt it, honestly. That's not who Danny is. He's probably telling some version of events where I'm the villain, where I overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. He's probably moved on completely, unburdened by remorse. And you know what? I hope he's okay. I genuinely do. Not because I want a relationship with him. Not because I forgive what he did. But because holding on to hate is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. I don't hate him anymore. I just know nothing about him. He exists in the world, and I exist in the world. And those worlds don't overlap. That's as close to peace as I'm going to get. Last month, I got an email from a young writer. She was working on a memoir about her own family, about being the scapegoat, about finally walking away. She asked if I had any advice. I thought about it for a long time before I responded. I told her to write it anyway, even if it costs you, even if it makes people uncomfortable, even if your family never speaks to you again, because the truth matters, because your story matters, because somewhere out there is someone who needs to read it, who needs to know they're not alone in feeling broken and used and invisible. And I told her that it won't fix everything. Writing about it, walking.